LaserHodl, welcome. It's an honor and a pleasure to get the chance to speak with you finally.
Likewise, I'm a big fan of your show. Love the signal that you're putting out there. So it's a huge pleasure to come on and have this conversation.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. There's obviously so much to talk about. I'm not sure where to start, so I might even hand it over to you. I've got a lot that I do want to bounce off you through the course of this conversation, but is there something in particular that's been on your mind as of late? I know you've been doing a lot of conversations on some other pods, and that's all been very interesting. I think I've listened to them all. What's based on where we are at today, what's top of mind for you?
Well, I mean, look, my purpose, my intent, my mission is to help people break the fear spell of this whole the last 2 years and what I expect will be the next 8 years. Zoom out and understand that what we're actually experiencing is the defaulting in the largest way that's ever occurred, and not COVID, and not a cyber pandemic, and not a climate catastrophe, and not a crisis of racism, and not a new wave of terrorism, right? All of these things are they're Trojan horses that are keeping you distracted so that the world monetary order can be reset. And so my story is when COVID started in April 2020, I remember the images coming out of Wuhan. I remember how canned they look. And I had a twinge of suspicion. And over the coming weeks, I started to realize that what we were seeing was basically they had in 2009 we had the housing crisis, and they had managed to kick the can this far down the road, but they weren't going to be able to kick the can any further. And so COVID looked a lot like a cover for default. And I tweeted in June 2020 that if you know the whole thing's coming down, what you need to do is execute a controlled demolition so that you can rotate the world out of the old monetary order and into the new monetary order. And that's what I expected to see from central banks. Fast forward all the way to now, where you have Christine Lagarde saying that everyone needs to get vaccinated. So, it's been surreal watching this play out. It's been scary to a certain degree. And I felt a kind of calling to come help people contextualize what we're seeing so that they can opt out at every layer, so that they can put their family in a better place. Because, we can't fight these waves, to be honest. We can't stop what's happening. We can learn to surf. We can put ourselves in a better position, and we can hopefully deliver individual sovereignty through this monetary reset, and allow Bitcoin to do the hard work of unwinding the seigniorage of money printing.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us, those of us who were paying attention, probably at least shared the suspicion that an event like this, and perhaps events prior to this, were either directly caused by or facilitated for some reason to obfuscate the issues that were happening in the monetary system, perhaps. Because there's no certainty, right? We can't know for sure the motivations, the incentives, the different parties or people that contribute to events, really, generally. But it seems mighty convenient that we were kind of all, obviously, as Bitcoiners, participating in a monetary transition and anticipating a monetary change. If to put it far too simply and just saying like fiat currency is going to, unravel. And then we have, this circumstance that creates a very convenient mechanism for transitioning to another monetary system while adequately removing responsibility from those who might who might be responsible for the control and degradation and unraveling of the existing system.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. When I say monetary reset, this tends to confuse people because they get the images of like Bretton Woods and a negotiation, in terms of the governance academics of nation states and how they see organizing the next chapter of society. And it's, well, that's true. That's a type of monetary reset. But I think a better way to frame this in your mind is that so governments are like large companies, and they have balance sheets, and they have cash flows and GDP. And the current system has been kept alive on life support, and they've employed every trick in the book, and they're basically in a corner, and they know that it's coming down, and they know that the solution to this, if they wanted to keep the fiat experiment going, is something that looks like central control and powers beyond what we've ever seen. And they know that society will not orderly give up what they had and go into this new system. And so and they would be in a terrible place if they allowed it all to collapse and they go, how about you join this? So countries need a way to rotate out of their old balance sheet into a new one. And they all have that need all at this one moment. And so typically countries compete, right? They're competitive enterprises, but right now their incentives are aligned. And I think that explains why you're seeing what looks a lot like coordination, collaboration, because they all have the same need to rotate out of their unworkable balance sheets into something new, rotate their societies, their people into the next chapter of what we will all live through together, the next narrative, the next storyline of the world.
Yeah, I agree. And money is very much like it's a distributed mechanism of coordination, right? And so it makes total sense because the realm of conspiracy is just fraught with uncertainty, right? So there's almost no point in identifying individual actors. I know in some cases, we could have a higher probability of being confident in, applying some, blame or agency to certain entities or groups or people. But if we the general premise of money being a distributed mechanism for social and economic coordination, right? And so when that mechanism breaks down, and I would say the primary mechanism, when that mechanism breaks down, the number two in that hierarchy of coordination, let's say, has to step up to the plate, right? Has to fill the void left by that coordinating capacity being diminished. And I would probably say, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, that centralized government control, the monopoly on violence, centralized governments, however you want to refer to it, that's at number two. At least that's the perception in people's minds. And so when one is relatively diminished, the other has to come up. But of course, the difference in application is that one creates order via the emergent behavior of all the participants that use that mechanism of coordination, whereas the latter is a single source of coordination that becomes imposed on everyone downstream of it. And so, as I think we probably share this perspective, a lot of the people that are wrapped up in the latter, they don't appreciate the difference between the two. They're just responding through their own incentives and their own conditioning and their own stories. But nevertheless, the felt sense of the attempt to coordinate by the latter is, because it's an imposition, is a felt sense of imposition, tyranny, authoritarianism, coerced behavior by the people who are subject to it, because it's basically the antithesis of emergent order, right? It's centralized, imposed order. And so this is what I try to stress this with people, close to me that I talk to, because you lose everyone every time you invoke any kind of any sort of conspiracy, again, however justified it may be. But if you take it from the angle of all we're dealing with here are mechanisms of coordination, communication, exchange, etc., then all that matters is how the relative dominance of each of those mechanisms and what the effects are of one in particular becoming more dominant, either out of necessity or out of a particular objective from a given party. And so, and I think that's an easier case to make, that and it's basically the case you're making, saying, look, for whatever reason, the emergent order that comes from the coordinating mechanism, that is a money, has been impaired since the fiat standard, 50 years ago, let's say, but we're way at the end of that impairment. And as a result, the breakdown is increasingly evident, and the breakdown is felt as increasing imposition on freedoms, on liberty, coerced behavior, centralized control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for that reason, if we believe that that is true and the monetary unravel is going to continue, we should not expect a reversion of any of those sensations or circumstances of being imposed upon, because it's a very natural outcome of a different source of coordination and order having to be imposed on a market or on a society.
Yeah. So you nailed it. I mean, so we go about our lives doing voluntary commerce, and our individual aim is to produce value for the world, store that value in something that holds it, so that we can trade it when we need it. We can trade it for different types of value. And so, I could learn a skill, I can do something that helps the world, I can retire, I can send my kids to school, on and on. But here we are at monetary reset, and you feel this interventionalist force coming into your life. Everyone feels it. And it's like, oh, hey, buddy, I'm just trying to do that human thing where I'm out there interacting with all these network participants, producing value, living my life. Why is this interventionalist force showing up? And well, it's largely because we believe that we're interacting in a neutral money. Most people do. Most people, they don't think about money too much. They're like, okay, I use this money, and this is kind of how I navigate life. But what you don't realize is the money itself is a form of intervention. Fiat, at least, is a form of intervention. And at that second tier where you have governance, at least in today's form, is the interventionalist. And part of what's happening is their intervention, the actual printing of money to smooth out these short cycles. So we get bailouts and we get different forms of intervention. They're trying to smooth that out because in their mind, I mean, I'll try and play devil's advocate against my own position. They want to provide the type of orderly society that allows you to live your life. Right. So, okay, we need to smooth out these little booms and busts, but there's a bigger boom and bust in the long cycle where those tricks won't work anymore. And the balance sheet basically becomes in a state of disrepair. And so they have to introduce a bigger intervention, one that we all feel, because the alternative is emergent chaos. It's absolute chaos because well, everyone kind of realizes that your country is broke, right? So when you all kind of realize, like, oh my gosh, our country is broke, and to what degree were we relying on them for confidence in our day-to-day life, right? We all kind of knew in the back of my mind, oh, they backstop all of this stuff, and you realize that they can't, and they can't, and so I think that explains you go from small intervention where people, they, Occupy Wall Street, you get annoyed, you go, hey, why are we bailing out all these people, right? And it's like, okay, well, that's a vulnerability to the system. We have to intervene. We have to create money and smooth that out, because that's the whole reason you can live your life, right? You have this orderly life. But then, now we're feeling the big intervention. And it's an intervention that's happening across the West and in the East. And so, yeah, I don't think it's it's not very good to cast this as a they per se. I mean, certainly it's not a cabal in the way that people sort of imply there's a like a theistic, religious, good evil element. I don't think that that's very useful. But it is a system of incentives, right? You have the individuals who are participants, and then you have the governance individuals who are interventionalists. And within the category of interventionalists, they are the ones that run and operate the monopoly on money, either through influence in the form of like cronyism or directly. They're actually at the helm. And that category, the incentives create a top. And so there actually is a they, in the sense that there's a community of folks that have the largest amount of influence given the incentives that they reign over. But it's not the they in the way that people think about it. Like it's like this cabal around a table. Honestly, it's closer to something like a cartel, which is to say a set of businessmen that operate countries as if they were line items in a portfolio, and they drive the top order incentives of that business with shared interests. So they drive it in a way that it sometimes looks like they're competing, but it sometimes looks like they're coordinating. And so it's funny because both is true. There's no cabal, there's no they. We allowed, we demanded, we birthed this form of government that we're all living in. We did it, right? The people created it, right? It exists because we allowed and wanted or thought or were allowed ourselves to be led into it, what have you. So the ownership belongs on every individual. And so there's no they in that sense. And it's not some boardroom of demons that are trying to capture our soul. I don't think that explains it well enough. I think so it's a we thing, but at the same time, the incentive structure creates an upper echelon. It creates a top within the players that actually exert control over the incentives themselves.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. I've often thought that because, many of us perhaps, at various points in our life have explored at least or considered the various conspiracies that are on offer. And I would never be so arrogant to suggest that, as you say, they don't exist, because they are more just like concentrations of aligned incentives. Yes. And, anyone who has differing incentives than you they are conspiring against your incentives by definition. Right. So like if you and I are competing on something, right, like my incentives have their locus or focus on my benefit within a certain domain, yours on yours. If we're competing for, limited value, limited goods, resources, et cetera, then I'm conspiring against you in order to benefit me. And on an individual basis, like that's really normal. When you get, and I think this is largely perverted by the monetary spigot and how that in itself is centralized and controlled, and then everything downstream of it. But the punchline is like you get these hugely powerful centralized entities, yes, with concentrated incentives that in many cases may be counter to the incentives of other far larger factions downstream of it. And so it seems conspiratorial because it is. But, we probably in our frustration with that, dramatize the nature of those centralized incentives and the people who are playing to them more so than perhaps is valid.
Well, dramatization comes from a lack of understanding, right? Because you need to fill in gaps, and you need to, and also the idea that you want it to be an evil cabal is, let me just say, humans are prone to victimhood. So if they're not just normal people acting in their own interests, given their position, and they're actually evil and they're coming after you, that makes you a victim, right? And so it makes sense that we would be prone to believe that this is some supernatural force coming at us, and not to denigrate the idea that this has some layer of theism. I actually think it does. I think it has a very layer of theism, but merely to say there's a secular view in which in which basically there are folks at the helm, at the reins, who have a control over some of society's most potent incentives. And they task themselves with the caretaking and steering of the orderliness of society. And they don't view, I don't imagine they view that as a evil. I imagine they themselves view it as some good or necessity, some needed thing. And so you could say, like, okay, incentives must create a they. It must create. You can't have. It's not flat. It's not flat. That's not how the world actually works. You have incentives, and you have different. You have a you have a power hierarchy, and at the top of the power, the mechanisms you have are stronger, and at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? And so there has to be a they. It's just not the they that people imagine. And the word conspiracy is a great word, because what it does is it takes something that is actually secular, planners, people who steer, people who think about governance, people who think about cycles, and it turns it into this inflammatory word that's outside of the Overton window. So if you start saying, oh, it's a conspiracy this, it's a conspiracy that, so now all of a sudden you're painting yourself as politically untenable, right? I can no longer interact with your thesis because it's this inflammatory, sort of dramatic, like you said, thing. And so I don't think the word conspiracy is very useful anymore. It's been kind of deteriorated by this political gamesmanship. It's more accurate to say there are planners. There are folks that steer the narratives of society in order to provide orderliness, right? And they view it as a necessity, and that they are in that position. It's a responsibility, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. And, going back to what you said a little bit before, where there's two components that I think are interesting there that's going to lead into a perhaps larger component. But in this system, it's so much about, well, it's so faith-based in the way that the reason, the reason why all of this intervention occurs, let's say the bailouts and the money printing and all that kind of stuff, is to maintain faith in the integrity of the system, because that is the primary thing propping it up, right? So absent true economic, like, let's just simply say, like, the emergence, the natural emergence of a free market chosen form of money, right? Absent that mechanism for holding up the faith in the system, as it were, we have a completely faith-based system. So it necessitates intervention.
You need the government. You need the government theater in order to transition between areas of low faith.
Right, exactly. And so you, as the real unavoidable economic consequences of any economic system continue to emerge or impinge upon, the system that's being artificially propped up, then the intervention in order to maintain the faith in the story, more and more of that is required. And so you mentioned, you said, like, they task themselves with this function, and, like, yes, on a mechanistic level, you could say, well, that makes sense, they need to. But on a higher level, I think this is where this ties in with faith. Faith is, first, they're actively managing a faith-based system because it's not constructed on fundamental economic principles, what I would call, like, more real principles. But I also think there's an element, like, I perceive a large degree of narcissism in the people that assume those roles in our modern culture and society, right?
Yep.
I don't think it's very
if
just let me get this one thing off, and then I'll hand it over to you. I don't think it's, they're obviously not aware of it in large part, but I think part of the reason for that narcissism is because the role of the traditional faith, let's say, like the religious faith, has been so diminished and disregarded in our world today. And there are valid reasons for critiquing it. But the punchline, or as far as this particular analysis is concerned, a truth or a system of order higher than oneself is in effect a mechanism of instilling humility on an individual. And if that is done away with, and not only just done away with, but like so arrogantly discarded, then I think you leave the door open for far greater expression of narcissism. And as it would happen, I think you could call the fiat culture that we often refer to as like, a hallmark of that is definitely dramatically amplified narcissism. And that's found its way into these systems. And as a result, these people don't even question the notion of whether or not tasking themselves with managing such a complex thing is even right or just or good.
Or possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, we said government drama, and they need that to manage through low faith, in between places, secular kind of moments that they manage through it. And it's funny, it reminds me a little bit of the shtick that we see the Federal Reserve do, where a lot of their job is basically creating a sense of confidence, signaling to the market, hey, we got this, keep the faith should stay high. And how much of it is actual actions? A lot of it is signaling. A lot of it is the act of Jerome Powell getting in front of people, doing a spiel, and people reacting to that. And it's you could say that the Federal Reserve is it's a monolith that's pretending to be decentralized, right? So there is really no separation between the government and the Federal Reserve. It's the money gets printed when the state wants it printed. Sure. But the Federal Reserve is the separate institution, and even they pretend to be this network of nodes that are not controlled, right? So they're like, oh, we have these different locations, and it all rolls up through balanced power into the Federal Reserve. And then you have the act of Jerome Powell, who's doing the dance in front of investors, and that's all a faith game, an interventionist faith game. And you could zoom out and say that is very similar to what governments do in terms of the long cycle. It's basically they need to create the appearance of orderliness, and then they need to, and you could even say that to a certain degree, countries themselves are line items on central banking's balance sheet. They're experiments, governance experiments, and you might even say that they're learning how to, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say create order for the world. And they run these experiments in these long cycles, and they learn a bunch. And as the long cycle inevitably comes crushing down, the bubbles pop, gravity takes hold, they carefully collapse the long cycle, and they take their learnings and launch the next narrative for the next long cycle. And you might say that is the book of business. The book of business for central banks is to harvest society's sacrifice, but also that in order to be able to keep doing that, you have to steer society. You need to keep expanding. So it's a kind of an imperialism, because the money printing, time theft, that actually needs to be hidden behind growth. So you have a constant need for growth, because if you don't have the growth, the fiat experiment ends, right? So it could be 1971 to 2030. That could be it, right? But they don't want that to be it. They want it to keep going. And so they need a bunch of new growth stories imaginary problems that they're going to solve with your family's life savings, right? And so you take that framing, and it starts to make sense how you would get these this plethora of NGOs and think tanks that come out with narratives for the next monetary order. And so your Klaus Schwab and Davos, it seems to be it seems to be one of the leading ones, and they come out with this Great Reset narrative, and it has all these catastrophes that we're faced with as a species that we must sort of shelter in place, make it through this tough spot with COVID, but we're going to immediately move on to these other mammoth problems that the world needs to solve together with our family's life savings. Climate, racism, cyber. It seems like they might be queuing up some alien thing for a couple decades from now, but they all have the same shape, and so it's funny. It's we see this interventionist order in the small places with our own central banks, but we also see it in the context of the long cycle, where and of course it's coming from, of course there's a source, right? You can't have, in a complex system, you can't have this much mimicry, this much collaboration without a source. You can't control a complex system, but you can create feedback loops. And that might be the best that you can do to control. And so my best take on this is that the monopoly on money sits above the monopoly on force, and that those two monopolies have been married for about 400 years, and it looks a lot like what they want to do with this next chapter is fold in another partner, and that is big tech. So you get a monopoly on money, a monopoly on force, and then a monopoly on tech. That seems to be the move here, and of course, as a people, as just that first tier participants that live their life using money to do voluntary commerce, we wouldn't allow the state to grow this, to allow these central powers grow beyond imagination, beyond what we've ever seen, without a very good drama, right? We need that story. Why? And so I think, you might say, well, you can't have the central bankers, instructing the world directly. It makes a lot of sense that they would hatch dozens and dozens of NGOs and think tanks in order to push this into the think space, to push this into the ears of politicians, these problems that we need to come together to solve as a world, that we can't, it's much bigger than a nation state. All these things seem to push us into globalization, right? All these problems, they're too big for one nation state, or they affect us all, right? And so as much as the idea that it's a conspiracy that pushes you outside of the Overton window, as much as the idea that, well, this is a complex system, no one can simply control it all, but you can create feedback loops, and there is a power hierarchy. There at the top, there is people who control the largest incentives of society, and they see the fiat experiment is either ending or it's going to be reset. And I think that context is so important to understand, because well, you can treat it as a lens, and you can start viewing the events of the last 2 years and actually the next 8 years through it. And man, that's been so helpful for me, because well, geez, you could even take the Afghanistan thing and say, well, if this is the largest sovereign default of all time, and this is reset, then why would we disgrace U.S. military might in the eyes of the international community, right? Is that to de-emphasize dollar hegemony? And what would replace that? Is it some Is it some like more like a globalist West backing bucket coming out of the IMF? Like it allows you to think from that place. Okay, so why would the US suddenly start, have this new military cooperation with the UK and Australia and France? Is it to de-emphasize a global US military might, dollar hegemony, and replace it with kind of a cooperative globalist social scoring West, right? That is now going to together rise. And so you'll have kind of social scoring technocracy China on one side and social scoring technocracy West on the other side. This is really key to understanding, because these things do fit together. And when you think about it through the eyes of money printing, through money, a narrative does emerge. Now, how accurate we are, like you said when we kicked this call off, you can't know and you can't say. You're very far away from the mechanisms that allow this to occur, but we can see the empirical evidence. We can see what's happening on the ground floor, and we can use that to feed it into the thesis and harden it or disprove it.
Yeah, I agree. And the usefulness of frameworks like that, and I would say, and we probably will discuss a little bit, a lot of us are familiar with the sovereign individual, right? And I think that book allows you to contextualize things through the use of a framework that's proven to be considerably, proven to be effective at predicting things. And as a result of that, you place more emphasis or validity in the framework itself. And those frameworks help you to interpret the chaos far better, right? Not be completely at the mercy of the inability to understand or know the genesis or the reasoning behind certain events, right? So you're able to rise above it to a certain degree and have a more macro level view. And, I think about this all the time. Like I think everything has a rhythm, has a pattern, everything. I mean, like that's how the universe works. If you can't, and if you can't see it or perceive it, then move across scales, right? Move up a scale, move down a scale, right? So if you're down here on Earth and you look up at the sky, what patterns do you see? If you zoom out, what patterns do you see? Like there's always going to be a pattern. And I think these frameworks allow you to, they may not give you certain information in minute detail, but they allow you to see a pattern. And then they allow you to, with higher degree of probability, determine the proper action to take in response to what seems to be happening. And, again, to this idea of the failing coordination of the money necessitating the coordination of another kind via centralized systems of control. How should I put this? The sovereign individual thesis is simultaneously playing out, right? Because I don't think they didn't spend that much time on the money there, but let's think about it, right? Like people are more and more able to establish sovereignty in their life, right? They're able to derive income that's not geographically determined. They're able to sequester their wealth in ways that the centralized powers can't, don't know about them, can't access them, et cetera. So we have this confluence of macro trends, and I know you've discussed this a bunch, as have many others, that, and maybe it's always like this, right? Maybe it's always this razor's edge, yin and yang, where like there's this tremendous force for increasing the individual sovereignty and freedom of the individual. But because the system from which that's emerging out of was entirely predicated on the utility and declining utility of centralized structures, because of, let's say, the Industrial Revolution and how society and culture and economies coalesced around that, will increasingly attempt to preserve itself, right? And so you've got this painful separation of those two things that were previously codependent, and now they want to break up, and it's extremely messy because both of their livelihoods depend on being successful.
Yes. Yeah, it's participants versus interventionalists, right? It's it's families versus central planners. It's and not in the cyclic sense. And it's almost like as society advances, we spend 50 some odd years becoming highly centralized, where the collective matters more than the individual. And that is actually what produces the pushback and the reversal of the pendulum swinging back towards decentralization. And it's not like we're staying in one place, going from centralized to decentralized. We're advancing as a species, but the rhythm of it is it's this oscillation between central planning collectivism and sort of dangerous freedom individualism, right? You have this oscillation, but there is a destination. We are heading somewhere. I mean, Svetsky talks about this wonderfully in that for however much time we devote to criticizing the nature of central planning, money printing, it actually birthed Bitcoin. It birthed our species discovering an energy money. And we could not have an era of individuality allowed to have without that. So it necessitated it. And so it was the toil that enabled our species to stumble upon energy money. And this is good because this actually eliminates the they. It puts it back on we. It says the species had need of centralization at that chapter, and now we're discarding the need of that as we've discovered energy money.
Right. And so the 21 million Bitcoin question is, how much do we resist that, and at what cost? Collectively speaking.
The sovereign individual is awesome because it really nailed the idea that it's not through offense, it's through defense. Like asymmetric defense is the best form of freedom an individual can hope to establish. It's if you basically draw up the drawbridge in all places of your life, and you vote with your feet physically and digitally, and you push your monetary energy into the structures that enable your sovereignty, you will create that world. You will create that world, and you will inspire others to join you. And if it's true that we are at this threshold where centralization cannot be tolerated by a certain group of people who are just ready for the next chapter that of individualism, then that will create a trend, and that trend will be emergent and very powerful. And they didn't mention anything like an energy money. They didn't really touch on that too much in that book, but it's
one paragraph about encryption, related money. And I guess they missed that point where, if it's an encryption money, then that, necessitates energy expenditure, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess we can forgive them because they were pretty damn spot on a lot of others.
They were focused a lot on the how, almost like the game theory unfolding, right? Like, okay, assuming that it was time and there was a need and there were individuals that saw that this could be done, how would it unfold? And I think there's a lot to that, because even with Bitcoin, it's like, okay, Bitcoin solves the money, but everything else is up to us, right? It's solving the money isn't enough to realize a era of individualized freedom. It's just not enough. It's vital. It's critical. I can't even imagine how we would do it without solving the money. But you need to think about things like, well, if you have unstoppable money, can you get unstoppable communications? Can you get unstoppable food? Can you get unstoppable tech in general? Can you create unstoppable schools? You would need a culture to emerge, and sort of an unstoppable society based on peace and individual responsibility. And that's going to require more than just solving the money, right? We have to kind of take the baton.
Absolutely. And this is why I think about and talk about a lot the individual transformations that this revolution is instigating or inspiring, but also necessitating, because and part of that is the emotional turmoil that I'm sure many of us are experiencing right now, right? You doom scroll on Twitter for a little while and you're like,
Yeah.
the world is absolutely ending. And there is a lot of really fucked up things happening, obviously, but us figuring out the proper way to calibrate our emotions to most effectively maneuver this environment is, well, a journey and a task that we all have to take on. And it is of the utmost significance. And as a result of doing that, I think we're different people on the other side of this. I said, I think the last halving, I reflected on how much people had changed just over the course of the last 1 or 2 years, and I kind of joked that by the next halving, we're all going to be a bunch of like neo-Spartan Jedi philosopher king savages or something, because the times are going to require that refinement in us, because it's also uncharted and it's also of the utmost significance, right? It's the greatest game to play. So I like how you referred to drawing up the drawbridge, and our task is to like fortify defenses everywhere we can and basically win the battle without firing a single shot, as it were, right? Like just starving the opponent of everything that they might get from us and keeping them at bay. And I think, that is super important. It's why I tweeted out yesterday, and I've been a laggard on this, and I know you have some experience and competency here, but what are the different ways that we can opt out? Because, again, there's this emotional, the frustration, the impulse to fight fire with fire, to push back. Yes. And I get it. And, and I feel it all the time, but the greater part of me knows that that's probably the least effective strategy, at least at this point. I'm not saying it's never required, but like, I want to exhaust all the means of opting out defensively and more effectively first, because that, pushing back in any sort of a physical sense is obviously the absolutely last resort as far as I'm concerned. And, someone mentioned in your tweet about having this chat, like, how do we regulate emotions during this unprecedented time of just complete chaos from, seemingly complete chaos from every angle? I think having a broader macro framework helps to assuage some of those emotions, because it brings some order to the chaos, and that's always helpful from an emotional perspective. But, as you say, Bitcoin is amazing, and it's going to become even more than it is, and it is the focal point of this change. But it seems like work will need to be done in all other areas to shore up those defenses, and as a result, gain the greater stability and transform into that person that, again, because my last point on this is, you said, we're not just, there's a tendency, and especially before the last 18 months, like, we kind of know what Bitcoin's going to do. We kind of know what it is, what it's going to become, how it's going to change things. But maybe occasionally the part where you're not going to get the Renaissance world unless you have the Renaissance people, right? That's what makes a culture. That's what makes a world. Like, you're not just going to sit on Twitter with your, keep stacking, and just like one day you're going to be scrolling and be like, oh my God, what a fantastical Renaissance 2.0 Bitcoin world we're in now. It's like, no, it comes through the transformation of the actions and perspectives of each individual, among whom, and we are among them, so that's one of the things that's been helpful for me, just to realize, like, all this resistance, all this emotional turmoil, all this frustration, it's the signal to me, like, I hate to use a kind of trite cliche term, but like, the obstacle is the way, in that respect, where it's like, that's signaling to you that you need to transform to accommodate that resistance or that frustration. And that's why this whole journey that we're on is like, very much, and for more reasons than just this, a spiritual one as much as an economic or monetary or cultural one.
Yeah, the suffering is the mechanism that pushes you towards growing, towards becoming. And if you meet that suffering with courage and humility versus victimhood and anger, is the difference between whether you're sitting at home or you're becoming sort of the great becoming the great men that will need to become in order to produce the great houses that will need to emerge in order for a renaissance to occur. Old great family lines used to exist, and that was in part a consequence of hard money, and the way that societies were organized were less centralized. It relied on great families to actually be the example and provide the productivity for society. And I think we're going to get a swing back to that. So yeah, that needs to occur. And so it's not enough for us to shitpost. We need to become the strong men that will bring back good times. And, I think part of the reason why society is so weak is that, we do have voluntary commerce. It exists. So there is a hierarchy of productivity still that is, but it's being it's that comes from being able to control the incentives of society. And so
I lost you there for a sec. Can you repeat that? Part comes from.
So we have a hierarchy of productivity because there's still voluntary commerce in the world, and there's still entrepreneurs that create value. So that exists, but it's been overshadowed by a hierarchy of power and entitlement that comes from being at the reins of the incentives of society, the strongest incentives, money printing, and various governance incentives. And so what Bitcoin does is it basically eliminates the hierarchy of power and entitlement, and consolidates society into a single hierarchy of meritocracy and productivity. So if you produce value, you end up with security and flourishing, and if you don't, you perish. It's produce value or perish. That's sort of the worldview of an absolute hard money. And the funny thing about that is, all the Malthusian spells that central planners tell us can actually be solved by a sufficiently hard money. And so, for example, like if overpopulation is real, then Bitcoin actually resolves it, because central planning is what allows the unproductive growth of the population, or population growth of the unproductive, I should say. If the climate is actually being spoiled, Bitcoin would preserve it, because if you don't preserve it, then you're only disenfranchising your heirs. You're hurting your future. You're hurting your house, and you rely on that house because you can't rely on central planners. And if we're really too soft to endure like viruses, then Bitcoin would make us much tougher, because again, there's no central institution that's going to relieve you of your responsibility to be tough and live well in nature in order to honor your house and basically continue staying competitive within the hierarchy of meritocracy that Bitcoin forces on us. If like racial justice is required, and that's a huge crisis, then Bitcoin provides it, because it provides an absolutely flat in terms of access to mobility, in terms of access to voluntary commerce, in a way where there's no central planners providing benefit or friction to any group of society. And if like overconsumption is really that gross, then Bitcoin corrects that, because the kind of desperate hole that people have in their souls that comes from being forced to run on a fiat hamster wheel, where they're basically trying to fill that with soft goods and services as a recompense for that desolation. Well, Bitcoin replaces that with hard goods and hard services that you're very careful about acquiring, because you're trading your family's sacrifice for. So I think the key evidence that all of these Malthusian crises that we're supposed to come together to solve, and supposed to give central powers more so that they can solve them for us. Bitcoin is proof that those things are all over exaggerated. If there's some degree of truth, they're over exaggerated and they're being used to rein in a lot of the excess of our species.
Yeah, very well put. And I think in addition to the obvious, the obvious unintended consequences of this centralized intervention, which can account for much of these quote unquote problems, but also Bitcoin permits this pristine feedback system so that we're far more able to operate with the other people and our environment within a market or within an economy, because there's no distortion of the signal. So it permits for a pristine communication of preferences and how those preferences change in real time to our environment. And that's, fiat completely interrupts that by not having the direction and flows of resources and consumption predicated on pristine signals of preferences, but on the basically ideology or incentives of a centralized entity that imposes itself on all of that and skews it dramatically. So their direct intervention is, I would make the case, very much to blame for the degree to which any of these issues are actually problems. And then, of course, in such a system as it is, someone says XYZ is a problem. I mean, okay, I mean, how do I refute that in such a dominant dynamic or such a dynamic, complex marketing globe? And as you said, we were talking about how the sovereign individual, puts increasing pressure on these centralized mechanisms of control and power and incentives to preserve themselves. What do you know? What would be the best method of preserving yourself if you're that entity? And obviously problems that are difficult to define, difficult to prove, global in nature are the absolute perfect mechanism to attempt to retain control if you find it dissipating, right? And this is the state we're in. And again, I don't even know if that's intentional by anybody. I mean, maybe it is, but it's the natural consequence of self-preservation of a system of that nature.
It's also the source of despair and nihilism, right? Because you feel that things are hopeless when you're being inundated with these stories about how the excesses of humanity is causing our demise. And if Bitcoin replaces that with a hope that we can convert sort of this nihilistic excess into purposeful proof of work. And so I think that really is the basis of how to create this world that we're talking about, and how to begin opting out of the Great Reset, opting out of the fiat experiment, opting out of the fear and trauma being induced by this government play in order to navigate us through the greatest sovereign default of all time. It's knowing that that Bitcoin replaces all of those things with hope.
Mm-hmm. So let me shift gears a little bit, because I've seen some comments you've made on Twitter around this subject, and it's one that I've been thinking a lot about lately, trying to get an article out, hopefully this coming week or this week, or maybe next week. But it is kind of the role of religion or faith or God in this discussion, right? Because we continue to bump up again. Once you follow the path of many of these things forward, as I was saying earlier about how people have kind of replaced the idea of traditional religions and God with a faith in whatever else, call it the political system, the monetary system, central plan, whatever. What's the role, what's the significance of that conversation in what's happening now?
Well, I think, look, I'm careful to have a secular thesis. And the reason I do that is because I want it to help the most families possible. People who are genuinely in a whirlwind of fear and pain and suffering because of the last 2 years. And I genuinely want to help them navigate the next 8 years and beyond. And the thing that they can do to help me the most is act in their own interest by moving their family sacrifice into Bitcoin and then opting out of this at every layer. And so I have a genuine passion there. And so I've made most of my thesis secular, and also because I want it grounded in sound logic, right? I want to be able to test it with other intellectuals. I want to be able to beat on it and have this tangible element that we can chew on. And so I think it's important that any thesis about society is grounded in secular sort of empirical evidence, especially when the nature of what I'm suggesting is that this is a monetary reset. They're restructuring the monetary system of the world, and that explains all of the theatrics and all of the actual things we're going through. Now, that being said, so I'm a new Christian. Bitcoin helped me kind of, I think, helped me kind of it basically transformed my value system in such a way that it led me to Christianity, which was surprising to me because I was a pretty ardent atheist. I was spent my whole career in software, surrounded by progressives, and just literally at the source of progressive ideology. So it was out of body is the wrong word, but it was a very bizarre and hard to put my finger on experience of having your value system completely transformed and then having that lead you to God. And so have I looked at all this through the lens of theism? Yeah, absolutely. I do all the time. I think I like to say that there's like a theist conversation that comes after a secular thesis, because if you're a theist and you believe in God and you think everything that we experience is downstream of that, science itself, everything that you can observe and touch is downstream of creation, then of course you're going to do your best to use discernment to hone. If that is true, then everything that you experience is a practice in exercising and maturing your own discernment, right? Your ability to tie these physical experiences to your own theism. And so, I think there's strong theist themes here. Certainly in Christianity, the story of ultimate centralization is the story of end of times. When society basically gives up autonomy and individual autonomy and choice and meaning, you're trading those things. You're trading them so that the state can ameliorate suffering and hardship. So you're saying, I don't need these things God gave me. I don't need individual choice. I don't need all the meaning that comes from tragedy and suffering. I don't want that. You trade those to some collective so that you could eliminate suffering and trying. It's that effort to create like a heaven on earth. In the Christian story, that is the end of times, right? You basically, when you get to the last place of centralization, and that's when the end of the Christian story occurs. And so certainly it makes a lot of sense that in these in-between reset periods of society, that theism gets a lot of increased interest, right? So you actually have a spike every time society goes through these resets. And that makes a lot of sense because people basically see the struggle between individual and families versus the centralization of decision-making and autonomy in society. And so, to a certain degree, you could look at my thesis and say, okay, so the West is going to consolidate into a single, like, great reset, transnational outfit. with a Great Reset military and Great Reset money and a Great Reset governance and Great Reset cyber law and Great Reset social justice, right? One single outfit. US, Australia, UK, France, the Five Eyes, this type of thing. And you could say, okay, so you're going to get a consolidation of the West based on or using COVID and probably cyber as the mechanism in order to consolidate these countries. And okay, in the next long cycle, you might go into a kind of globalist Western technocracy and a globalist Eastern technocracy. And, if you zoomed out, you might ask, would man try and consolidate those two into a single government? And part of me thinks that there's merit to the idea that if the fear spells of COVID and cyber can be used to consolidate the West into a single governance structure, then you might be able to consolidate the East and West using fear spells of climate. We kick off the next long cycle and you have this, social justice technocracy of the West versus this imperial communist technocracy of the East, right? That's the story of the next long cycle. But how could we continue to compete when you have this increasing drumbeat of climate catastrophe bearing down on humanity's soul? Wouldn't it make more sense that these two great governance structures join forces to fight climate change together? And if the climate catastrophe was severe enough, I certainly could see people being softened up to that. And you'll have a lot of religious pushback because it would trigger the end of times in theist mind, and so they'll have that pushback. And that's why I suspect that we've seen a lot of cooperation with Francis of the Catholic Church, and you also see this kind of UFO alien fear spell being like the ground being laid on that, like little seedlings, they're queuing that up. And it makes me wonder if they're going to have that fear spell in their back pocket in order to unite any religious pushback against unifying the human species in one single governance structure. That you could almost have, in the same way that the COVID pandemic really served to wipe clean previous norms so that we can reshape society. You could imagine an alien UFO false flag being used to wipe clean religious norms so that we could join together in a single religion. And so, I've had lots of discussions like this privately with religious folks. And so, of course, we are connecting the dots between what we see from a secular point of view in terms of reset into the religious teachings and stories. And there is a trend towards consolidating governance. And so I think what I would say is, yes, every religious person is aware of that, keeps an eye on if we are trending towards consolidated governance, because it's meaningful in theist teachings. And so that also feeds into the desire to call the they a cabal, because I think it kind of plays into the drama of if you have an evil group that's trying to consolidate the world, and give you the mark of the beast and you won't be able to buy or sell without it, these type of things. I hope that informs why people they're drawn towards that thinking. For me, spending most of my life in secular technology and being a new theist, I like to I put my secular hat on and I view the world through monetary incentives. And then I do like to have a theist conversation, but I wouldn't want it to limit the reach of the overall thesis, if that makes sense.
It does make sense from a practical point of view. But from the point of view, to borrow a term from Peterson here, speak the truth and whatever happens is the best thing that can happen. That's kind of the approach that animates me. And so like, I understand that I might be able to package my message differently to appeal to a broader audience, but doing so would mean it's not my message anymore, because part of my message, part of the thing that I express is a curiosity or a humility to the unknown and an active inquiry into it. So and of course, I'm not criticizing you. This is, everyone decides for themselves how to go about doing this. But, my own approach is to be as sincere as I can with what I'm seeing, admit what I don't know, try to explain what I'm seeing, probabilistically, let's say, and continue to refine that and react as though my strongest held beliefs are true, right? Because what else can you do? And it's interesting. The reason why I asked the faith question is because, and I've been spending a lot of time on this lately, and I'm more and more, I don't think faith is opposed to logic. I think it's the ultimate source, right? And I think what's happened in the world today, I think, so symbols convey meanings. Stories are made up of symbols. The degree to which they affect us, they speak to archetypes within us or even something deeper, kind of resonates a truth. And this is why these stories are so powerful, right? Because I think you've called them Malthusian fear spells, and you can correct me if I'm not applying the term correctly here, but my assertion is that whatever story most motivates our behavior, and it does so by orienting our value hierarchies, then that is effectively your God, right? Because our value hierarchies are comprised comparatively, right? So like, this thing is better than that, this thing is better than that. And where we wind up is something at the top, and then things higher, ordered below them in relative valuation for each thing, so that you can move forward in space. So if the story that you're most motivated by is the, climate change, social justice, that sort of story, then all your systems of valuation are going to conform to that story. And as a result, your action is going to conform to that as well. I think one of the tasks of humanity, and which is why I'm such a critic of being so frivolous and doing away with the enterprise that of the human civilization over the last 5 to 20,000 years, which is of trying to determine what story most accurately depicts an underlying reality, which is the one that we experience. Because if we can use that story as a map to graft onto that reality, then presumably we're best oriented to what is true, and therefore our systems of valuation and action can most closely reflect that. And if we can interact with the fundamental structure of reality, let's say, or call it God or source or whatever, with the most accurate representation of it, then presumably we can act within it most beneficially or most successfully. And so I know there's a number of religious faiths in the world, and my opinion is that this enterprise is what characterizes all of them. And every single one of them probably has valid criticisms. But again, I think the mistake of modern culture is that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. But the thing is you can't not have a quote unquote God, a thing at the top of the hierarchy of meaning that determines and dictates value systems and therefore behavior. All you're doing is swapping one out for the other. All you're doing is choosing one. And this is why I think there's been such an emphasis placed on making sure your God is the right God, because, and that's an enterprise for every individual who ever lives to make, because it will determine your systems of evaluation, your behavior, who you become. And what I think has happened is that as a result of doing away with the former notion of that enterprise, we've allowed ourselves to be susceptible, collectively speaking, on a global culture, to stories that attempt to fill that void. But unfortunately, those stories seem to be catering to, the incentives of these people, these groups, these perspectives, mentalities of the people we've been discussing. And as a result of that, they're far less oriented towards truth. And what I think is so special about Bitcoin is that it helps us to reconstruct systems of valuation. And as a result of that, I think it brings us closer to the truth of what is, right? To use the term God, because it allows us to more accurately determine relative valuation and in exchange and in cooperation and interaction with other people. And then I think it kind of bubbles itself up to the top of its own hierarchy. It's the hierarchy of relative valuation as determined by interpersonal interaction. And therefore it sits, really high up on the hierarchy of value itself, and other things that might be up there with it. And I don't think it's any surprise that Bitcoiners are beginning to espouse these sorts of things, but things up there with it would be love and beauty and nature and health and relationships and freedom, these things, these ideas of transcendent value. And I think all of those things are the closest things knocking on the door of ultimate value, ultimate truth, ultimate form of the reality that we experience. Again, what you might call God. So in that way, this mechanism or this tool for reordering value hierarchies aligned with truth in the world actually brings you closer to the idea of what God may be. And that's a pretty interesting, revelatory, dramatic, significant event or a realization, if true.
Well, mankind certainly has adhered to religious stories for a long time, for thousands of years, and certainly fiat society seems to have down-engineered our proclivity towards those stories and created a vacuum. And in that vacuum.
Now, why do you think that is? Because I'd love to get your thoughts on, like, let's say we killed God, right? God is dead. Why did that happen? Why was it specifically something like fiat that would have kicked off that process?
So centralizing money, it seems to be very good at ameliorating, I won't say suffering, because suffering is very hard to eliminate, because if you eliminate one form of suffering, another tends to take its place, an opposite shaped suffering. But it tends to ameliorate, relieve the individual of burden, responsibility. And the idea is that you would be able to specialize. You would be able to specialize and contribute back to society, lift everyone up. But if that's not well balanced or not grounded in natural law, let's say, you would go too far in eliminating burden, and it would create a softening effect on individuals, and such that the individual would become softer over time. And part of the reason I don't go too deep into the religious thing is, in part, I'm an adolescent into the space, and so I don't want to denigrate the community that I respect, and I don't want to create, because I speak on the secular side with quite conviction, and I feel reasonably comfortable with that side of the thesis. I don't want to have that leak into the Christian side and give the impression that I'm an expert in Christianity. I'm within the first 100 hours of exposure. I'm spread out
Yeah.
over 6 months. So take that as a sort of clause as I wade into here that I'm no expert, and there are plenty of conflicting points within my value system that are vestiges of my secular value system colliding with my theistic value system. But I will wade nonetheless and make silly mistakes. Just know I'm making them out of a place of humility and not confidence. So my view of this is that in no small part, a large degree of suffering flows from the finiteness of man, from the limitations of man, and that suits God just fine. When people say, why does God let babies die? Why does God let tragedy happen? It's not my perception at this point that God views his role as, it is not his responsibility or desire to eliminate suffering and tragedy, especially those that flow from the limitations of man. And I think because of that, the limitations, the suffering, the tragedy has utility. They're important. Because you have to choose as an individual whether you take ownership or you're a victim. And I think that's the fundamental choice that God wants you to make. That is basically decides your trajectory towards like a heaven or like a hell. Because if you take ownership, it means that you take all the suffering and tragedy of being and you hoist it up on your back, and then you basically set out on a journey. You build yourself up. You become tough, so that you can earn your glimpses at good. You can earn your chance at being, so that you become worthy of being. And I think my grasp on like the Christian existence is that the world is a sort of fallen stage with wrath, with the tragedy and evils even of the temptations of man. And what God wants is individuals of ownership to endure and thrive through that anyways, and become an example for good, and in a sense look towards him so he knows who is worthy of his company. And so you could say that central planning and the centralization of money, it basically over protects, it over shields us from burden, and burden is a key element in becoming individuals worthy of God. And almost like there's a famous painting about this, or story about a devouring mother. It's the mother loves her kids very much, and so she shields the kids from too much of the realities of the world, the tragedy and suffering of the reality of the world, and the dangers and the evil of it. And a consequence of that is that the kids are basically unable to be. They're unable to navigate the world because they are so frail and weak. They've been overprotected. And so the mother's this sort of all-consuming demon in a certain light, because she's, for her own sake, has done a huge disservice to her children. And you could say that overbearing governance is kind of, it rhymes in archetype. And even you can go so far and say that like a communism, especially like that in the dystopian novels of like The Giver, where it's like this perfect commune and there's no suffering and there's there's perfect equality and there's no fear or worry about what you'll eat or what you'll do. Families are chosen, jobs are chosen. You're taking a drug every day to suppress the human spirit. That is almost the perfect manifestation of this all-consuming mother, and it's evil in the sense that in order to do that, you have to eliminate choice. You have to eliminate many good things with bad. You have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can't eliminate suffering without eliminating meaning. And so any institute that tends to ameliorate too much choice and suffering is chewing into, it's digging into the realm of what God demands of every individual, which is the ability to take on your burden, become tough, take ownership, and go out and be a good example in the world. And so, you could say that, like, if there was a monetary system that best aligned with Christian values, it would be something that did not relieve individuals of responsibility and burden, and was kind of harsh in that your choices, you would feel the consequences of those immediately. Like you could say the learnings of the market would not be hidden from the market. And you can go in the other direction. You would say, what would be most aligned with like the devil or hell? And it would be something that basically stamped out all choice and meaning so that no suffering would exist. So I think, I think there's a lot to say about why Christians seem like the light bulb seems to be coming on, and they seem to be looking at Bitcoin and be going, wait a second, this puts the autonomy back in the individual, back in the family where it belongs. This can disenfranchise the parasitism of the rent seeking of these central planners. That is a huge negative draw on the spirit. So Jordan Peterson would probably argue that the correct value system for the human species is the Western religious stories, and I think it all comes down to that personal responsibility, ownership of burden, building yourself up, and I think I agree with him on that. But I'm still early in my journey of tying the pieces to what I see in the secular thesis. And so comment on that and grab a piece of what I just said, and let's have a conversation about it.
Yeah, sure. I've got two things off the top of my head. One is, I think perhaps the reason why there's resonance in both of these groups of people is because I think what they both represent are systems of valuation that most closely graft onto, align with, stem from what is actually the truth of the reality that we contend with or that we experience, right? Because I think that's what they do. One does it in story form. It attempts to use meaning to convey a structure, a system of valuation that is most closely adheres to what, for lack of a better term, may underlie reality, may be the force that generates the reality we experience. And I think Bitcoin, as you just articulated so well, is a system of valuation that best grafts onto the reality that we experience. And so they both, almost in a sense, do a very similar thing vis-a-vis something grander and greater that lies, beyond perception. And such is the reason why they become a gravity well for meaning and value. And this is a domain that I see a lot of very, very interesting discussion and thought emerge around as we push forward into this renaissance. I don't know if you mentioned this, but what was the instigate, like you said, this is a relatively new domain for you. What instigated this interest or this opening up? I'm not sure if you mentioned that already. If you did, I apologize.
Yeah. So once I took the orange pill, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders in terms of some of the despair I felt in my life around that I believe emerged in me as a result of being on the fiat hamster wheel. So I felt this nihilism, this pit of despair coming from the fact that I was viewing my toil and my work and my career through the lens of getting out. Right, I was like, finally, I'll be done with this. I'll be off of this, and so my moves were always to ensure that I would be able to get out. I wouldn't get trapped on the ever accelerating wheel. But I felt the classic dilemma of as my means increases, as my productivity increased, so did my expenditure, so did my lifestyle, and of course the inflation of our money accelerates that sensation. It multiplies that sensation because you feel that your money is not going as far. And so, if you're not in a piece of work that is giving you energy and meaning, I was in software and I love software, but the software industry, I'm not a massive fan of. I'm not a massive fan of how that industry is shaped and the dynamics of it and the incentives of it. It is a soft money industry. I mean, it has access to some of the cheapest money on earth, and so it creates all the dynamic and actors that you would expect. And for me, that created it made it hard to believe I was a good actor when I was surrounded by that. Now, when I started moving assets into Bitcoin, and I basically got pulled into the rabbit hole, it made me realize there was a way to exist that was outside of that mode, that fiat mode. And I suddenly, what I thought had to be an exit became an off-ramp out of the whole fiat world and into a world of inverse opposite value structure. And it just resonated so deeply in me that, I just poured into history and philosophy. I was drawn to Jordan Peterson. It was the classic orange pilling. Suddenly I became obsessed with ancestral health and lifting and sun. And it changed everything about how I lived. And it was funny because only a couple months in, I had a weird feeling like, am I going to end up being a Christian? I had a weird feeling. And it was literally like 12 months later is when I finally was ready enough to say, okay, let me read the New Testament. And I just finished it the other day, actually.
So let's hang here for a sec, because again, I'm digging into this because it's such a common theme I'm seeing, right? Different people in different stages, maybe different characterization, definition of religion, a particular religion, all this kind of stuff. But like, we keep bumping up against this door. And one of the things I like to explore in various ways is, because you said, like, why the refocus or reframing or reemphasis of ancestral health, of nature, of sunlight, of being strong and healthy, of, and I referenced a few minutes ago, like, these are things that are basically non-priceable forms of value, right? Like I can put a price on the 50-inch flat screen, and basically the opportunity cost that Bitcoin confronts me with makes that value judgment extra clear and in your face. And a lot of us don't have any chairs because we're short Bitcoin, right? So it subsumes the things that have a market value, that have an overt obvious value. And when you have such an intense form of value in your life, of course you're going to get a reframing of all value, in all the ways and things you bestow value on. And again, one of my kind of thesis is that one of the outcomes of that is that what remains when that gravity well of value subsumes everything that's of relatively lesser value, the only things that can stand up to that, the only things that are left are things of, I've been using the term transcendent value, perhaps it's not the right word, but things like your own health, your own sense of well-being, your own approach to philosophy or God, the relationships you construct in your life, your sense of freedom and liberation. Like, these are things that are impervious to the gravity well of nominal value comparison, let's say. And so like, I'd love to know a bit more how you recognize that the system evaluation was changing in you to increase the relative value of things like, you know, lifting and health and whatnot. And what do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I think the source of, maybe the greatest source of nihilism that can exist is knowing you are not able to act the way that you are at the deepest level, and or that you are a cog in a wheel that's basically a cog in a machine that's preventing you from playing your role. And that's what I felt like. I knew I had I had a strong draw towards principles and what was right. You know, I had done well in my career, but at the same time, I found the environment toxic, the attitudes of people toxic, the whole world I was living in toxic. And so my point of view was like, okay, treat your career like, you know, and at least this is the way it is in software, treat it like you're a professional athlete. Get in, kill yourself for, you know, maybe 15 years, maybe 20 years, and then get out. Don't lose yourself in it, right? You're going to have to sacrifice a part of your life and sacrifice a part of who you are, but you should be able to recover it after, when you're done. But then that done moment gets pushed off and off and off. And that's what I think the experience of living in a fiat system is like. It is one of despair. And so when when I actually switched my thinking into a Bitcoin standard, I got this kind of deep spiritual fundamental relief. It was this feeling of relief that I was able to, suddenly I was not in that world anymore. I looked at my actions that were still in that world as like, in the same way I knew that I would probably end up being a Christian at some point, I also knew I was probably going to end up quitting and not that long. It just suddenly became clear to me that my whole life path had changed. Once the light bulb came on, the orange pill did its actual work. You know, once I got over the common things that Bitcoiners get over, when I realized that there's not a shitcoin in the world that matters after Bitcoin, it's all shit coins. And when you actually start thinking through Bitcoin, that suddenly all the things I viewed as valuable that I would do one day filled my life in short order. It went from these things I knew were valuable that I was putting off because of the fiat hamster wheel, to where I was spending almost every day, all my spare time on these, because my time horizon had got lifted almost instantly. And suddenly I was thinking about family lines and how to live principle in my life, and like spending time looking at history, and like you know, I realized the facade of the fiat world was, I started recognizing it in all these places. I recognized it in fiat health and fiat pharma and fiat food, and I recognized it in fiat governance, and you know, and so I said, okay, you know, almost like in Seinfeld, you have George Costanza. He has this day where he's like, I will do the opposite. If everything I did was wrong, I will do the opposite. And I kind of had one of those where, you know, I smirked to myself and said like, okay, well, I'm doing the opposite in terms of money. And like, what's the opposite of fiat food? What's the opposite of fiat governance? And with each one of those things, it enriched my life greater and greater. I felt more content, more this kind of steady happiness, the steady fulfillment, because I realized what I was doing was becoming unattached from central planning, from the fiat system, and I was starting to emerge. I was standing on my own, and that was this incredible rich feeling that I, you know, once I got a whiff of the trajectory of that, I kind of knew like, oh, does the moon lead to God? I think the moon might lead to God. And so that's what it felt like to me.
It's so fucking bizarre though, right? Like, I mean, when you're explaining that, I wanted to see if you could identify attributes. I think there are many, but you know, the off talked about, and I think ultimately too narrow, but definitely still very powerful, is like, okay, well, once you know that your surplus time, energy, capital is secured in a way that you can have a high degree of confidence that it's going to be available to you in the future, and it's not going to be this, constant suck and drain on you, then, and how does that shift in timeline, in your sense of time, in your sense of possibility, in your sense of security, in your sense of optionality? How does that reframe your value systems and your value hierarchies? And to hear it from you, and I've heard it from many other people. I mean, I haven't heard the just do the opposite one. That's kind of funny, but it makes total sense, right? And it's just so funny that it speaks to such a consistent impact on the construction of value hierarchies and the behavior that results. Right?
It's like going from a place where you feel like you're helpless. You're just trying to figure out how to play a game because you're competing with society on who gets to save. I hear stories all the time like, oh, my uncle got sent back to work. He lost. He wasn't able to save, right? Like he wasn't able to invest well enough. So who gets to save? Who gets to retire? And that creates a helpless feeling. It's a death match just to have a livelihood. And so that's a suck on the soul. It really hurts you in a deep way, knowing that the system does not respect your time and sacrifice. It steals it. And there's a righteous anger you feel when you finally wake up and realize my sacrifice is being stolen. My family sacrifice is being stolen. And so do you sputter out with nihilism? Do you sputter out with wrath and become like a useless martyr just because that emotion's so strong? Or do you actually beat it by becoming unstoppable, so to speak? Do you and Bitcoin was the first step in that. Is like I realized my sacrifice was untouchable once I did that, and that served as the basis for a transformation. In that, like, well, if I can make my family's time and effort untouchable, can I make our communications untouchable? Because is it a right that we have privacy to talk with each other in confidence? And I had that same righteous anger, and instead of going and lashing out and becoming a martyr, I went like, oh man, unstoppable money, unstoppable communication. I went, if my health is being stolen by big food and big pharma, do I lash out and become a martyr and have this righteous anger, this wrath, or do I channel that into becoming building unstoppable health, an unstoppable body? And so that act of realizing I had the control to opt out, I had the ability to become this unstoppable, hard, head of a household, head of a family. That to me, that empowerment it almost felt religious. It almost felt like,
well, of course it is. I mean, sorry to interrupt, but here you were, 5 seconds ago, you're saying in the previous context, I felt like my soul was being sucked away from me. And I'm sure we've all felt that. And as a result of making this switch, which is predicated on a way to, again, safeguard your excess, your capital, your life force, whatever you want to call it, now you have the inverse feeling that your soul has been liberated in a way. And you're wanting to express that liberation outward into all sorts of different areas, into different people and all that kind of stuff. So it's like, there's no getting away from the religious. May not be a sufficient enough word, but there's no getting away from the profundity of that realization. I mean, there's something very, very special and profound going on there.
And it felt like I was being taken on a path, and if I just let go, it would transform me. And that's what's happened. I've given into whatever it is that's happening to us. I've given into it. I've submitted to it, and it has transformed me. And it's scary in the best way possible. Exhilarating is probably the right word that captures, a terrifyingly unknown experience. But through that journey, I had this tweet where I said, is God using Bitcoin to end communism once and for all? And you get these thoughts where you're like, I'm like, where did that come from? Because okay, if if you're a Christian and either you're heading to like an end of times situation where which is to say that evil succeeds until it doesn't, right? You have this you centralize, humanity centralizes so strongly that it brings about the Antichrist, right? Because that's what the end of times is in the Christian story. It's basically the success of the centralizing forces of man, until until we create our own God on earth. Well, and so people say, Laser, how are you optimistic despite all this crazy stuff you drop on us? And it's because I actually don't think that that's likely, given what I see happening. Because what it looks like is there's an overwhelming force that's going to decentralize us. There's an overwhelming force that's going to disenfranchise the parasitism of rent seeking, that will take us back to cement the individual, the family, and that's what headed me down the path of realizing that, okay, tragedy and suffering, that suits God just fine. He's not here to stop people from experiencing that, to save babies or what have you, to eliminate disease. That's not the goal. But if you want to tempt God, what you would do is you would basically threaten free will. If you threaten free will deeply enough, what you're doing is you're preventing people from being able to turn to him, for being able to build themselves up, from being able to venture into the unknown and become worthy of being. So if you really wanted to tempt God, what you would do is you would threaten that. You would threaten free will. And that's what over-centralization does. That's what perfect communism, it creates this perfect prison where you can no longer act. You're a zoo animal. And so, either we're hurtling towards the end of times, or God is lifting a finger and tossing it off. And that to me is like, that might be what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is simply an instrument that pushes off the final centralization of man. It gives us the instrument, the tool to take sovereignty back at the individual level, to cement the family, to cement the individual. And so I, that came out of me, that thought, last year sometime, and it hasn't gone away. The feeling that what is occurring is that we are threatening free will, and we are going past the threshold which God thinks is acceptable. And God is infinite, so something like a Bitcoin is completely inconsequential to him. But if the layer that we are basically capturing free will is at the money, it would make sense to me that we would discover Bitcoin at this time. It looks a lot like we are heading towards like a showdown at 2030 between the individual and the perfect prison of collectivism. And it looks like that's when we will know who won. And for me, it's there's something profound. There's something that is too coincidental for me to be comfortable with, which is all of the plans, the World Economic Forum, Davos, these steerers of the long cycle, the folks that engineer the narratives of society, they all want to be wrapped up by 2030. When you start looking at the Davos thing, you see 2030 everywhere. So that's when they want to fully realize this social scoring technocracy. And it's kind of like what you see in China, but it's just branded for the West. So it's wrapped in social justice, but it's the same system. It's a social scoring technocracy. They want to have that realized by 2030. I've looked at where Bitcoin's headed, and it looks like it's going to be like getting escape velocity at 2030. It looks a lot like that's what, there or right around there is when we get the super cycle. So for me, I feel like, why does that feel that is a story feels so much bigger than all of us? It feels bigger than Bitcoin.
The showdown.
Yeah, it does feel like that. So yes, I think about, yes, I have a theistic view on this. Yes, I think,
it's interesting. First of all, when that tweet that you sent out, I think things fall into the category, or on a spectrum of, at one end, ultimate truth, and at the other end, ultimate delusion, and then everything in between. And, Peterson has a version of this, but, mine, to put it simply, just came to mind when you were speaking, like God seems like the truth that dissolves illusion, right? And if that's the case, then the instruments of truth that dissolve illusion are more representative of the ultimate truth of God. And, it goes without saying that I think we both think that Bitcoin is one of those things, and hence this transformative effect and reframing of what is, and the how it permits a certain degree of clarity and rectifies some of the mental cloudiness and confusion that's occurring. I mean, it's all of those things and more. But I found when you talked about free will and how, like, that's in particular imposing or negating one's free will, one's free agency, is a particularly egregious offense on whatever force animates and orders reality or our experience of it. And that's really interesting, because because what I think it comes down to is, like, if you think that human beings are vessels for, to use like a commonly used secular characterization, like we're all just ways for the universe to experience itself, right? Or to use the more religious terminology, we are all, quote unquote, God's children, and perhaps our primary task is to understand God and express it out in the world. If either of those characterizations, one of the things that would be most offensive to that pursuit is limiting it, is stifling it, right? Is because basically in both instances, whether it's the universe or God, however, whichever one appeals to you, what you're implying is that they're both attempting to express and experience themselves through you. And imposing on an individual's free will and their free agency is putting a direct blockage on that. And then it begs the question, like, well, to what end? And it seems to me, it came to mind when you were saying that, it's like, well, to the end of someone else's priorities exceeding those of that animating force that's attempting to express itself through you, i.e., let's say the narcissistic individual entities or archetype that presumes itself the highest form of order, the highest God, as it were, and as a result justifies its stifling of that which is trying to come through you in service of its power. And
if you had an ID, John, a global ID, and everything you did was recorded by omnipresent surveillance and financial surveillance, so we could feed all your human activity as an input into a function that plans society. You had no privacy at all, and you didn't own anything. You literally were a cog in a machine. The problem with that is that would severely erode your ability to act, to be, to become. And so then the question is, how far do you have to go until you've basically required some small intervention by God to say, like, I will get my emergence. I will have my emergence, right? And that's the thing, is like, this social scoring technocracy that the West is trying to import from China is extremely invasive. On the front end, it's this social scoring communism. So as serfs, we would all live in this communist sort of social justice, social scoring society. And on the back end, it's this high-tech fascism. The state partners with industry titans, and that's how they operate the creature together. And the thing is, it really is asking people to capitulate autonomy all the way through to bodily autonomy. So it really is, in a way, asking you to give up your soul. You know, I don't think it's too far to say that. And it is in Revelations, they do say that you would have a number. They do say that you would have a number. They do say that you would have some tracking element. I think they say there's something in your right hand, and that you would only be able to
interact with the economy if you had that. So you would basically, it's a whitelist, right? So if you're on the whitelist, you're in. And if let's say your social score falls too low or you refuse to adopt this, you're an outcast. You're ejected out of society. So they do seem, they, us, we, society, mankind, we do seem to be hurtling towards this this system that does sacrifice the individual at the altar of central planning, a moonshot to basically transition decision-making from individuals and families to governments and computers, even AI, central planning algorithms that basically crunch all of our behavior. They take it as inputs and they try and produce the next primitives for society. And like from a theistic point of view, is like, are you going too far? Are you going too far? And I think we're just going to find out. We're going to find out. But it just strikes me as too, like, Bitcoin is too, it's the timing of that. Like it's swooping in and preventing us from being enslaved permanently into a perfect prison, and the type where most of society will fight you if you try to save them from it, right? They will not be denied their serfdom. Like that's how bizarro and scary the kind of path on the central planning side is oriented towards. And it's steep. It's not like by 2050 you won't have choice. It's I almost view it as like there was an A/B test between the Western Christian super empire with democracy, right? And they had that little hiccup where the U.S. had a republic for a little bit, but they were able to make it this test of democracy on one end and authoritarian technocracy on the other end in the East. And it looks a little like central planners are like, okay, the A/B test is done. We like B. we like that. We like that social scoring technocracy. Let's import that. That's what's next. And so what they're doing is, without your permission, they're basically ceding your and your family's sacrifice and your free will to boot. And yeah, it's very hard to look at that from a secular only point of view, because it does feed into you're basically striking down the lessons of all religious stories for the last thousands of years.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. And that even though the characteristics and the dynamics are different today, of course, to reflect modern technology and culture, et cetera. But like, I'm hearing you describe this, and it basically seems like, there's the manifestations of a false God, and then there's the manifestations of a true God. Again, like whatever you interpret that as, source, creative force of the universe, like whatever. And as you say, the religious stories of the last 5,000 years and potentially longer have always, at least in part, dealt with the danger of false idols, false gods, not being properly oriented around truth, and the dangers and the pitfalls and the consequences of doing that. And, perhaps this is just the same old story playing out the same old way. And, I don't want to sound so self-important but like those among us in this space that are first realizing this, it's almost like we are tasked with engaging and revivifying and rearticulating the truth. And that's quite a responsibility,
Jesus said, Jesus was tested in this courtyard, and they asked him, who deserves this? They hand him a coin. It was a gold coin, Caesar's, and they basically are testing him. And he says, give unto Caesar what is his, give unto God what is his, right? Which is to say, Caesar has a society. He has rules in that. With it, up to a point, play by the rules. Give unto Caesar what is his, but give unto God what is his. And so it's with this transformation of governance in terms of central powers such that we've never seen, is it Caesar's? Like your bodily autonomy is not Caesar's. Do not give it to him. Right? Your free will is not Caesar's. You don't give that to him. You don't. Your family's sacrifice, all of it, the way that they extract the productive capital of the last long cycle and reset, they extract as much as they can. That's not Caesar's. You don't give it to him. Right. And
but
so
doesn't Caesar only have anything because he violates any of those, because he has the power to take from you? I mean, what is Caesar's if not the ability to take from you what you believe to be yours?
Yeah. Right. I mean, okay, so that's a very good question. And you might say, what is the theistic role of the state? And maybe the answer is something like, to the degree that we cannot organize ourselves, there's a role for the state to provide a society. But as the individual rises to the occasion, as our technology, as things like Bitcoin emerge, our ability to organize ourselves in terms of a large homogeneous society of families, as that increases, Caesar needs to make way. He needs to get out of the way. And I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, not very much like Caesar to do so. I agree with your point, but I mean, I guess this is why Bitcoin is such a fascinating and possibly unprecedented inflection point, because like it was always necessary, like for that coordination and order that we desired, it was always necessary to imbue someone else with a high degree of power. And because that was kind of the thing that permitted the coordination, and we made that trade-off. Bitcoin seems to be permitting, if not a elimination, but a great diminution of that dynamic, where you don't have to make such dramatic sacrifices of different elements of yourself and your property in order to achieve that same level, if not a greater level of order. And so again, we're in this part now where we've reached the apex of the trade-offs required for centralized order to be the dominant form that produces order.
And I'm not sure that
now the antithesis, right? And and again, to that breakup idea, where like the two opposing forces are, you got the apex of the former with the emergence of the latter, and of course the breakup is going to be a little messy.
It's funny, in the past, when they launched like a communist society, what would happen is the government would take over the means of production, and it's very hard to run industry when you're not an expert in the industry. And so usually they'd end up destroying the means of production, and they'd be forced to export the raw resources of the country in order to import food to feed their starving country. That's typically how socialist countries fail. And so, of course, the next iteration of authoritarianism, where they combined parts of communism with parts of fascism, and they deployed that in China in order to experiment, and this social scoring technocracy emerged. That's very smart, because that says, oh, well, you have to keep the industry around. You can't have the government take over the means of production. You need to partner. You need to marry the means of production. Like, okay, that's very smart. And so I think we're going to see that this go round. But actually, I lost. Bring me back to your last point so I can.
Well, I was talking about just the breakup, right? Because
yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I remember now. So, but part of that society is the mental conditioning of serfs. You have a two-tier society in China. So most Chinese actually like the system because they believe it's necessary, and we're seeing this in the West too. A lot of people say like, oh my gosh, we need to resist this, and it's not clear to me that you actually can resist the Great Reset, because such a large part of society will probably want it, because they've been conditioned. Like they won't be denied their serfdom, and so I don't think it's a. I think the Great Reset actually succeeds, but I think what you're more likely to get is a fork. And so I think it'll be an old story played over again new. I think the Great Reset succeeds. You have these smart cities where they herd people into them. They're really kind of like, this is where they're more like a surf city, slave city, but they'll be branded as like this, high tech smart city, and it'll succeed. But Bitcoin will succeed as well. And because these communist societies are two tiers, you'll have the money tier above putting their sacrifice and their productivity into Bitcoin. And you'll have the folks that opted out of all this, who just went another direction, will be building a new society on the side. And I think what will happen is you'll have a gravitational pull into Bitcoin. And the more that money moves into Bitcoin, it'll actually gut the ability for these serf cities to provide for themselves. It'll be the same story as old socialist collapses. Because even though this time the state is married the industry men have also migrated to Bitcoin on the outside. And so that'll disenfranchise these socialist cities. They will collapse for the same reason they did before, but this time it'll be at the feet of Bitcoin. So I actually think you get a fork, and then you get a brain drain on the top tier of the technocratic cities, and that actually serves to collapse the Great Reset. But I don't think it's this, at 2030, the Great Reset fails and the whole world goes, okay, Bitcoin time. I think they both stand up. I think you'll have basically men that opted out, that took their families and didn't do any of this, just said, you know what, we'll be over here. That'll launch, and simultaneously they'll run, and then one will win over the coming decades. I want to say, like maybe by 2050, it'll be emergent. It won't be a big bang. And that to me seems the most likely outcome. And so people often ask, like, oh my gosh, who's going to win? And I think they both win in the short term. You need to choose where you are. Are you gonna join the surf city and see what that experiment is like, or are you opting out? Because I don't think there's an in between. And if you're opting out, you should opt out at every layer. It's not just your money, because big tech is marrying the state for this next chapter. So if half of your life is in big tech, you're not opted out, and you're going to be steered in that direction. And so, there's no boots on the ground as far as I can see. Most of the coercion of cycling people out of the old monetary order and into the new one, most of that, it's all coercion. It's not force. And so you have a huge part to play in to what degree you're going into that system or opting out. And so you and I, we talked about, like, okay, Bitcoin is step one because it makes you aware of hope. It makes you aware of your own autonomy, right? You kind of take charge of that. And then step two is probably something like zooming out and understanding the greater thesis, so that you're not in despair and you can actually act. But you need to get into the and we tweeted about this. It's the rolling of a sovereign stack, which is to say, we're locked down. Most of people's lives are at home now, remote. You do everything remote. And so, are you putting all your digital hours into the partners of this new society, or have you opted out, right? Are you on iOS? Are you on Microsoft? Are you on Windows? Are you using Gmail? Are you, on and on. These services that you use to store your pictures and your data and your communications, are you basically allowing central planners to feast on your every detail of your life, or have you shown them the door yet and said, you know what, I'm actually building this new society, so you need, it's 8 p.m. and it's time for you to go.
Yeah. And man, it's that for sure, and hence the tweet. And I think the best form for us to get into the nitty-gritty of the details is like offline, and then we can maybe do particular shows around like a set of solutions that are easy to adopt, once we kind of flesh out, because I think I want to do that for myself. And one of my motivations is not just what you just referred to, but it's as the noose gets tighter, it's going to inspire in us even greater expression of truth, right? And we kind of, I think about the idea of the martyr so much, because I think it's such a a beautiful representation, an idea, which is basically, the purest representation of the truth of a principle or ideal possible, which is so offensive to the relative illusion or falsity or dishonesty which surrounds it, that it creates this like bang, right? This conflict where either like the martyr is killed because its surroundings cannot put up with such a pure representation of the principle existing, right? Therefore, it has to be destroyed. Whereas the martyr, in its conviction of the very principle, accepts that outcome in order to express it into the world, and recognizing that they cannot actually express it to such a degree without that sacrifice that they're making, right? It's a beautiful idea and metaphor, and actually, actual thing that occurs in real life. But to borrow just a piece of that is, in our attempts, and someone who speaks publicly like myself, I know at some point my desire to speak and represent truth and the tightening of the noose will come into conflict, right? And that this will result in censorship, deplatforming, blah, 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 all that stuff. And so it's vital, as far as I'm concerned, to be transmitting the message in domains that cannot be censored, cannot be deplatformed, and start moving people to consuming these messages in those domains so that it can persist even when the noose tightens.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. I mean, you have your friends group. Are you using SMS? Are you basically feeding the beast with your communications such that you're assisting the transformation of society into this AI central planning technocracy? Are you feeding that? Or are you in a place where you have end-to-end encryption and you're basically reclaiming privacy? That's a very small example, but it's very significant, because at this point, I think we all need to start being very conscious about, are we feeding the beast, right? Because in the same way that the way that you spend your money creates a world based on the goods and services you favor, right? And so I think it makes a lot of sense that right now, okay, let's say you don't want to, you don't want to see a world defined by medical apartheid. So don't put your money into the things that are supporting it, right? Never invest or spend your sacrifice on things you don't want the world defined by. You don't want the future defined by.
Very well said.
But you could expand that into the digital realm and say every hour you spend on a platform, people say, oh, code is just a tool, it can be used for good or bad. That's true. So you need to discern, where you're devoting your digital wealth in terms of your data, in terms of lack of privacy, in terms of your time. Are you devoting that into platforms that are actually going to serve to imprison you? and that's something that it's not readily apparent to people until you take this like Apple debacle, where it's okay, so it's come to light that Apple's going to start scanning your photos for whatever it needs to look for. And of course they're using, I think, like child exploitation as the mechanism to engineer consent among society. But a lot of privacy people are saying, whoa, like what precedent does that set where now you're just able to, using computer vision, start looking for anything in all the photos of all your customers? And so that's an important thing. Do you say, okay, I'm going to vote for that by not leaving, or I'm going to leave, right? So the economy runs on money, but tech runs on attention. And so where do you put it? And you mentioned something really good, which is to say, I don't think we need to be like panicked about it, because as tech crosses the line, it only serves to create unstoppable tech that is resistant to it, right? So it almost is it's the seed by which things like BitChute and you get these various like unstoppable video platforms come out. So as you censor harder and harder, the people that really care about this go, you know what? We're going to go over here. as you exploit people's communications more and more, it only serves to strengthen like privacy-based, strong encryption messaging platforms. So it's more that we should be aware that that's going to play a role, and an increasing role over the next 8 months as these means of coercion become stronger.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly, and I hear a lot of, is obviously not just me, a lot of people are, I'm not a super tech savvy person. If anything, my interest in delving into Bitcoin over the last, 5-6 years has inspired me to move, try to increase my competency in some areas of that, but it's not something that comes naturally. And so like, I naturally delay these things, but, is reaching a point now where like delaying seems like a big mistake, because you don't want it to be sprung on you, right? Like when it, not only do you want to starve the beast, and I understand totally the rationale for that, but you want the interruption to everything, how you communicate, your expression, your networks, your income, all this stuff to be minimally influenced when the noose again, continues to tighten and around you. So I think it's super important. I want to ask you this. It's kind of related, but, doing those things permits even greater freedom, right? So like, unfortunately, I have to admit that occasionally in these conversations, like I'll use slang to refer to things that might trigger censors, right? We've probably all been there to some degree. Or, maybe even in some cases, although I can't think of any right now, might avoid certain topics. And I hate that. Like that I hate
You
that.
censor yourself. Yeah.
Exactly. And so part of the appeal of these tools is the liberating feeling that they give you. It's like, wow, I want to put myself in an environment where I'm even more able to liberate whatever it is that is genuine about myself. And the reason why I set up this question with that kind of context is like, and this feeds into the whole discussion we've been having about digging deeper into the meaning of Bitcoin and its relation to quote unquote the divine and reorganizing of value structures, et cetera. It's like, a component of me is like, wow, things are crazy. The kind of strategic, methodical, rational or calm mind is required there in order to orient things properly and play the game and in the shifting landscape optimally. But another element of me has a sense of wanting to let go even further into this mystery of a phenomenon that's happening. So like to put it kind of simply, like I want to get up on these calls and rant about like Bitcoin's relation to the divine, like constantly, right? Because like I almost feel by not doing that, I'm holding something back, because there's interesting questions there. I don't know any of the answers, but there's something. I feel like there's something genuinely unique to be explored there, and what lies on the further down the trail of that exploration seems to me to be of extreme value. And so I want more and more to permit myself to lean into those things. But it's this kind of, tug between wanting to stay a little bit more grounded because of the dynamic and the nature and the dangers in the current environment and chaos, et cetera. And, wanting to go a little bit crazy, for lack of a better term, in exploring just how mysterious this phenomenon that we're dancing around is.
Well, I think there's something to be unlocked. If you could communicate in full confidence, you could explore the extent of where these ideas lead, including when they led to the wrong place. But you could do so because that act of that act of exercising ideas with someone in an uninhibited way is fairly critical for flourishing and ideas to emerge. And so, this theme of inhibiting the human spirit is always is always present in dystopian movies. And I'll go back to The Giver because I've used it a few times, but they take injections every day to basically suppress feelings of longing, suppress feelings of there could be something more, suppress feelings, that desire to basically let whatever's inside of you fully unveil itself. And it, to me, like, you look at, especially in times of reset where there's huge uncertainty, but there's also huge potential for the human spirit to basically emerge, and the state and the structure that governs humanity really has a strong incentive to suppress any emergence, especially in these times. So it makes sense, like the trend of censorship makes a lot of sense in that light. The trend of like lockdowns and social distancing makes a lot of sense. Like in World War II and in World War I, when they had to reset the world monetary order, they also needed you traumatized and terrified, sheltering in place, huddling under the state, waiting for orders, right? While they, again, used money printing to extract wealth and restructured society for the next chapter for the next long cycle. And so people would be, instead of being outraged and flipping the table over because you saw what the money printer was doing to society and saying, no, we're going another direction. Instead, they were able to replace those emotions with one of collective fear, like civic duty. And you said, you know what, it couldn't be helped, and we all made it through. And that's what that describes really well the effect thereafter with COVID, right? We're sheltered in place. And so you look, you're waiting for orders, you're huddled under the state, and whether you make it through, if you make it through this with no savings at all, you're like, whew, we survived. We all did this together. Like, at least we did it. We were all in this together, right? And so I think the state has great need to suppress the human spirit, because if we unimpeded had interactions like this, and this is a great testament, by the way, to technology. Like, they're doing this reset at a time when technology makes it impossible to stifle human communication, when technology like Bitcoin makes it impossible to stifle the degree that people can build their families up, right? So it's a huge testament that we're having this conversation, right? But that kind of specter of censorship, it's always going to be present as you get this ever increasing centralization. And I mean, you can take that further and say, it looks a lot like law on paper is being replaced by narrative, right? If you break the narrative, you are a criminal, right? And the new sort of state is arranging around the idea that they're narrative enforcers. And this is what you see in like pre-crime, right? So basically what they want to do is who is not going to comply, and that is what crime is now. And actually, this is very similar to what they have in China. In China, it's your social score is your god, because that determines if you have mobility, what you can do. And if you go below a certain level, there's only 3 punishments in China. I mean, the first thing is, so if you start trending in the wrong direction, they'll reduce your mobility. So you won't have access to goods and services or to move around. You won't be able to move up in life as easily. If you keep trending in that direction, then you'll get re-educated. So they'll come pick you up and they'll teach you how you're supposed to behave. And if you keep your social score keeps going down, you'll get disappeared, right? That social score has replaced law in China. They don't have law on paper anymore. And you could go further. You could say, in the middle of reset, pieces of paper like fiat currency, pieces of paper like law, and pieces of paper like ballots, they have almost no meaning. So you're in this era where none of these things have any validities. And people have that general sensation like, oh my gosh, law has ceased to matter. The ballot ceased to matter. I mean, even the currency will cease to matter. And all of those things are true. So it's a matter of, really appreciating and recognizing, look at what technology is doing. Because every time in in history, we would basically be at the whim of the state, right? You literally would be sheltered in place, being like just waiting for whatever the next order, hoping that you would survive the darn thing. And so now here we are, we're plainly articulating what is occurring. We're describing the way that the government is forced to navigate society through reset, how they use it to their advantage to reshape society for the next long cycle. And so this was never possible before. And the only reason we could do that is because our sacrifice, our time and effort is safely stored in Bitcoin. So it's absolutely incredible that we are living through this, and this is even possible, right? This puts us at the same level as the statesman behind the money printer. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And it is something I try to remind myself often, just like, it was never really going to be any other way. So don't lament the discomfort that's part of the process, because, the punchline is we're winning like crazy. It's sometimes maybe difficult to see that, because we all doom scroll on Twitter, and we see the breakdown in its various forms, because everyone, we can see into the entire world through everybody's phones now. And, if you're not careful with how those inputs affect you, they can cause you to construct a somewhat false perception of what is actually going on, which maybe again speaks to what you just said, which is like zooming out and having a bit more of a macro and historical contextualized view about like what is actually happening here. So, and then this comes back to the notion of hope, right? And how powerful that can be and how justified it is. But I'm just go ahead.
Like the loss of freedom and liberty in the physical world is real. That basically a social system with movement gates are being deployed everywhere. And that you could only move if you have a good social score. That's basically what they're trying to realize. And of course, it's the conduit is COVID, right? It's we need these vaccine passports, but really what that is it's basically are you allowed to move? Have you pleased the system? Okay, you can move. You can't. And so that's real, and that's the same kind of tyranny that's surrounding us in the physical world. I expect that to move to the digital world. And so I expect, in maybe it's at some point this year or next year, I expect the event that Davos and has been foreshadowing, this cyber pandemic, which will make COVID seem like a small nuisance. I expect that to create the societal problems that a KYC everything internet, a Great Firewall of the West, a government login for every service that you use. I expect that narrative to be commonplace next year, and so this is another reason. Like, okay, you can opt out. You can vote with your feet physically, right? You can say, "Man, being in California at this point, like we're not going to vote our way out, so I'm going to go put my financial energy into an economy that gets it, like a Texas or Florida, right? Like you could vote with your feet physically, and you should. I think that's a very good thing. But you might have to do the same thing digitally. You might have to say, like if Facebook rolls out, okay, John, you're gonna have to log in with your government ID. It's like, and that's going to determine if you can move, what permissions you have, like in society. If you would want to vote with your feet digitally too, so I think there's good reason to not deceive yourself about what's coming. Like it is the loss of physical and digital liberty, but only if you stay in one place is kind of the hope that I'm bringing, which is to say Bitcoin is teaching us. Like, let Bitcoin teach you. Bitcoin brings asymmetric defense to your money. And balkanization, physically moving, creates it basically raises the cost of tyranny. Like if you go somewhere that it's just expensive to reach you, like you've just voted for a new society to emerge by doing that, right? That's how a renaissance happens. If Texas ends up being the capital of mining in the world as a result of China, and then let's say the US tries to ban Bitcoin in some fashion, well, that might only serve to cause Texas to secede because you've attracted all these brilliant capitalists, right? So, I think that same kind of physical arbitrage, we're going to have a digital arbitrage where, like, it sounds crazy now, but you might actually have to move to get an ISP that doesn't require government login.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think things are going. And, in terms of like not catastrophizing, right? Not becoming so paralyzed by fear from doom scrolling. Like, this is why the macro view helps. Because if you go, okay, this isn't science fiction. China does this now. They do this physically. They do this digitally. Checkpoints everywhere. Social score, digital ID. Right. That's what they do now. I mean, they're still early in it, but that's what they're rolling out. And this is what the West wants to roll out too. So it's not science fiction. It's a new form of automatic algorithmic governance. Right. That's what they want to roll out. So it's not, even though dystopian movies are scary, like, you can steady yourself and say, okay, that's real, it's happening. But they're focusing on cities and they're focusing on the biggest tech services, right? Because that's where the return on tyranny is very good, right? Because that's where everyone is. And so if you listen to what Bitcoin is teaching you, it teaches you to become expensive to tyranny. And so then my mission is to teach people to become so expensive to tyranny that they lose, right? So if moving out to Texas makes it very costly to bring tyranny to your door, that is something, arguably we're learning from Bitcoin. If moving what services you use makes you very costly to reach from a digital point of view, that's something that Bitcoin's teaching us. If moving off of fiat food makes you costly to reach in terms of designer virus warfare, right? That's something Bitcoin is teaching us, and on these traditional timeless values of basically taking responsibility for your household in all ways, such that you're no longer thinking about things in terms of we must stop tyranny. It's more about like, oh, what do you mean? Like, my house is very fortified in all these ways, and so I just know there's me and there's millions others of houses like me, and we'd be very expensive to bring tyranny to, and through that, an unstoppable, peaceful society can emerge.
Yeah, I agree, because, all of these things that you're discussing are different ways of either defending or opting out, right? But the fact of the matter is when you opt out, you simultaneously opt into something else. And I think this, as we've discussed already, like, this is how the other culture, society, civilization actually emerges, because you get all these people opting into a different way of doing things. And I think, as is especially in the case in something like Bitcoin and its peripheral technologies and all of that, is like you were referring to earlier, kind of like the balkanization and then a competition between jurisdictions. And like, it may, sure, it may play out on a really long timeline, but I also think that Bitcoin so outcompetes, or will so outcompete, as a economic and sociocultural unit, those that it may be compared to in the balkanized world, that the relative advantage or benefits of the former will become so evident that will accelerate the transition. And just like a very simple one of the reasons why that may occur is, like, think of the efficient use and allocation, pricing, use and allocation of capital, right? And that's basically the mechanism through which wealth can be created ultimately. In today's world, we have artificial cost of capital updated on a quarterly or at least monthly basis in many cases, and highly manipulated, blah blah blah. The existing interest rate and fiat currency system. And then in Bitcoin, like in something like the Lightning Network or whatever markets ultimately emerge, like, you have a real-time cost of capital that's meeting the supply of capital with the demand preferences for capital, and generating the most accurate cost of capital, and therefore allowing for its most efficient distribution and allocation. And like that alone, that dramatic increase in the efficiency of the costing and application or allocation rather of capital is such a huge competitive advantage. And then you layer on all the other different dynamics of the people involved and the technologies involved and all that kind of stuff. And it could really happen faster than we may think, you know?
Yeah, well, central planners are in a hell of a position because reset requires that they turn up the volume on a lot of these imaginary problems. And that allows them to transition from a collapse of faith in government money to a new structure of government money, a new structure of society. Now, in the past, there's never been an alternative, right? And so this is particularly dangerous for them because, well, fear is a powerful motivator, but flourishing might be more powerful. And it might, you know, and so if I was an investor or an industry titan or someone of large money, you know, and I was acclimated to parking my wealth in government treasuries to some degree, things that the state backstops. Mm-hmm. The stock market, for example, and it's different depending on the country. Like certainly in China, what the state backstops might have a different shape. We might even be able to talk about Evergrande a little later. But and now I see, okay, the state is managing this reset, so there's going to be a stage of a collapse of confidence, and then they'll try and best they can rotate people into the new system. Okay, so a common way that they try and restore faith in government money is they go, okay, we got a new backing bucket, and it's full of all these tangibles that you trust, right? It's full of gold, and it's full of land, and it's full of all these things that you and it's full of debt from various countries. So like you might see with the IMF that they start this backing bucket emerges with member countries' hard assets in it, and you might see that central bank digital currencies are backed by it, and that might be the reason why we should all have faith again in government money, right? Beyond all the new exciting features of central bank digital currencies. But if you're a large money, that it's a sliding scale. Like it's a very temporary thing. The solidness of that bucket. Like how long will that last? 10 years? 20 years? Like how long until they hollow out the foundation of that bucket and it just becomes wealth extraction again, right? It just transforms into what central banking always transforms into, which is the harvesting of society's sacrifice. So now suddenly here you are, you're in reset, you're large money, and you know that, okay, the government's doing a pretty good job promising you all these benefits. So you can go park your money in their fiat-backed whatever asset classes. Or you can simply park it in Bitcoin and you have a guarantee as to the transparency and the backing of it. You have a guarantee of what it's going to look like, not for the next 10 years, for the next 100 years, for the next 1,000 years. So I can't imagine being in the position of the government who is used to this old trick. Now they're having to perform that trick in the shadow of Bitcoin. I mean, is big money gullible enough to buy treasuries again, to buy bonds again? Well, I can't think of a single reason why you would ever buy a bond or treasury ever again. And that's a big problem for the state. I mean, I haven't heard one cogent thesis as to how big money would be recompelled back into state securities of any nature.
Me neither. It's a problem. It's a big
like
problem.
War. Okay, war maybe. Like that's war bonds could happen. Like you can imagine a hot war inspiring investment because spoils and claims over economies after that fact. Okay, but like, gee, it really is kind of this limp, weakening book of business, right? From big money's point of view, it's like, okay, what do you got to offer me? You're gonna have a hot war, like that's it. You don't have bonds or treasuries to really offer, and so I got into this when we were talking ESGs. It's like, okay, ESGs are going to pull mining closer to the money printer, right? Because it's a soft money incentive. But if you're an investor, are you going to invest in the mining operation that's dependent on the money printer? Or are you going to invest in the mining operation that can outsurvive the money printer? So it's, you get in this place where I think the things that government has to offer the money of the world is really being eroded quickly as people are waking up to Bitcoin. Like that arsenal of what they can actually offer, the reason should prop them up. Like that's running dry as far as I can tell. So it's very sketchy to be trying to go for this moonshot, this great reset. It's a Hail Mary as Bitcoin is becoming sort of the primary parking house for wealth.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a great analysis. I mean, we shall see, right? Because I'm sure there will be unique and desperate attempts that manifest, but it's hard not to agree in an analysis of the landscape and like this phrase that Bitcoin is dematerializing all other or many other assets and all other monies and processes, and like as you said, this is the game theory playing out, right? This is the obvious opportunity represented by the ability to quote unquote speculatively attack while this disjointed market currently exists. And like again, in the efforts to prop up the legacy one, you simultaneously create a massive opportunity to or maybe you accelerate the transition into the Bitcoin option, so I don't know, man. I don't know. You mentioned Evergrande, and a few people wanted some commentary on it. I actually don't have much to say on it, but I do have to pee. So if you got anything to talk about it, go for it, and we'll shut it down after that.
I don't have a ton to say. I think like Evergrande, their debt represents like 2% of China's GDP. And I think you have international investors kind of getting nervous because if they're not able to pay 300 billion of debt, like what does that mean? What does that mean for like debt elsewhere? Like the US has like 290 billion, some huge massive number now. And so, what I would say is it's useful to view things like this through the lens of reset, and China can backstop whatever they want, and so it's all signaling, right? And so one might look at this and say, are they sort of weathered for collapse in a way that the West isn't? And would it be strategic to basically signal? Because the thing is, it's not like we're on the cusp of the greatest sovereign default of all time. We're in it. So it's just a matter of the games that prevent people from realizing it. And so, that grants countries the great responsibility to not pop the bubble first. But if it arises that there's a strategic reason to do so, then it wouldn't surprise me to see someone knock the first domino over. And so that's how I view Evergrande. It's hard to say. It's very but looking at the confluence of signals, it's like I could see. They think that the West is hustling to try and leapfrog their their social scoring technocracy. The West looks like it's trying to consolidate into a single like Great Reset West. And so, what would happen if you like made people realize in the West that they were in the middle of the greatest sovereign default of all time? That's like my current view on it, at least.
Right, which going back to what we started with would presumably greatly shake the faith that underlies the existing structure of the system in the West, right? Presumably that would be part of the motivation.
Yeah, it could be. And like the thing is anytime something new happens, just don't over speculate, right? Like, so have a very malleable thesis and allow the empirical evidence to harden it or soften it, right? And so as long as you always have that posture, I think it'll serve you well in terms of not losing sight of the greater picture. Originally, I thought what was happening was financial interests in the West were making way for China as the next superpower, and so China was giving the West a way to usurp their own governance structure, democracy, and replace it with social scoring technocracy through COVID. So that was what China was doing. And in exchange, we were saying, okay, you could be the superpower of the world next go around. Just give us access to your emerging markets through Belt and Road. So we'll get out of your way in the Middle East. You can continue with Belt and Road. We want access to those markets. So that's what I thought the arrangement was. But now it looks a little bit to me like the next chapter is something like a open economic competition between a newly consolidated social scoring West and a now open for business China that's expanding through Belt and Road. I think that is probably like, because you got to imagine it's from the monopoly on money's point of view. You are after growth. That's what you want. And that's why it's important to not think of it as a cabal. You're not after, you're after the maximum productivity and growth of society so that you have somewhere to harvest. You have something to harvest, right? And so you want to frame each chapter and competition is a good force for growth, right? So instead of just saying, oh, we're letting China win, I don't think it's that. I think it's framing the next chapter in terms of these two West versus East superpower competing with a upgraded governance structure of social scoring technocracy.
Yeah, man. I think all of this framework and the ones that we've covered, like, I do think there's utility in them, again, for kind of helping to orient yourself in what seems to be like chaos. I, of course, can't make any claims or have any degree of confidence in the truthfulness of them, right? Because it's so easy to be led astray. It's so easily to misperceive things and all that kind of stuff. So what I keep coming back to is like, I don't know, right? I don't know about any of that stuff. But what I do know is I value truth and freedom. And if I try to optimize for those things in my life, I have a deep and abiding faith that a better world will result, regardless of who is responsible for the current world that I am, let's say, critical of and trying to extricate myself from or change in some way. So, well, that's kind of a lead into saying, man, I appreciate your work, because even though I have that sense, like, I appreciate these frameworks and these perspectives, because part of that process of my trying to perceive truth is seeing with clarity, right? This is something I mention all the time, but like, if one of your most genuine pursuits is to pursue truth, then clarifying the lens through which you perceive it all is of the utmost importance. And
yes.
different frameworks and different patterns and rhythms that you can, even if only temporarily, graft onto a sequence of events can help bestow a certain degree of clarity, which amplifies and enables you to, integrate greater truth and then pursue what's most meaningful as a result. So for that reason, I appreciate that your voice has kind of come on the scene, and the insight and the perspective that you've been sharing. And like I said, a little while back, let's reconnect over the kind of opt-out tools. Give me a little time to, a little research and kind of figure out where the best place to attack it is. And then we can reconvene and really go through it so that we can, maybe even present something that's kind of low-hanging fruit to be like, step one, this is what to do, how to do it, and what to expect as a result.
Yeah, I love it. John, I appreciate you. And to your viewers, I'd say, building a thesis as to what's happening in the world is useful insofar that it basically informs that you can opt out of what's happening. So if you know the shape of it, you can merely not enter into the system that's being constructed. And so,
right.
In the way that Bitcoin brings asymmetric defense to your money. You can bring that to other parts of your life. You know, I mentioned ancestral health and sun and lifting, and you know, people doing that's the same thing. You can do that digitally with your digital services, and you could do that with where you are physically, where you live, right? That has a huge impact on your lived experience and what systems are you supporting with your energy, right? Yeah, so I think, you know, it's fun to, you know, don't get too drawn into the speculating and sort of the adrenaline rush of the doom scrolling, because recognize adrenaline is a drug, just like you can get addicted to dopamine for things that give you like a little bit of pleasure. You can get addicted to fear through adrenaline. So doom scrolling is actually addictive. The whole purpose of my spreading this thesis is to empower you that, you know what, you actually can opt out, you can become unstoppable, you can help this peaceful renaissance occur, and it's to you know, go through the paces and enjoy it and experience it together and realize we're so much more powerful than we realize, and a lot of that is due to Bitcoin, but it solves the money, everything else is up to us.
Extremely well put, man. Extremely well put. Thank you, and we'll do this again sometime soon, man.
All right, fam. Thanks.
All right, brother. Take care.